Today's guest is Stanley Stoll. He's the Chief Executive Officer at Knott Laboratory. All right, Stanley, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Tats. Appreciate being here.
Great. I noticed that you have sort of a Army background or Army Corps of Engineers background. I'm always curious about, that experience. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, the Army experience was I was in the combat engineering corps. I was airborne combat engineer down in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So less of what my profession is now as far as structural engineer, more of the demolition side of things was all of my experience in the Army. So
Mm.
a lot of fun, a great thing as a young man to go through, learn, mature, so forth. And Yeah, kind of see the world before jumping into educational career. Um,
Sure. What did you learn through that experience?
um, the Army was a lot of fun as far as leadership. I was able to progress through the ranks a bit and got into some leadership roles there, taking care of troops and subordinates, which is no different than today in my role. Um, Discipline, just integrity, kind of all those core values that would you would expect from a military service. Um, that'd be the primary things. Obviously, there was the technical components of actually jumping out of airplanes and going and whatever, doing demolition jobs and so forth. We would get attached to infantry and go do their breaching assignments and things like that. And so, yeah, it
So
was.
you jump out of planes and you destroy things.
That was a phase of my life. Yes, yes, it was a ton of fun.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's not for everyone, right?
Yeah, yeah. It worked when I'm 18. I don't know that I want to do it today.
There you
So
go. And then you went to get your education.
yeah, I attended two different schools. Ultimately, graduated from Louisville with an undergrad and master's degree in engineering, specifically structural engineering. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So when you went through that, well, what did you do after that?
I was working for an engineering firm at the time while going through grad school, and fell in love with existing structures. I thought they were complex. They provided a unique challenge. Everything wasn't straight. Buildings had moved, degradation had happened, and so I really kind of fell in love with existing buildings at that time and repairing them. There was a lot of opportunity for creative solutions in those situations. So I worked for that company in Louisville for I think about 3 years total, 3, 4 years, something like that, and then moved back to Colorado, where I'm from, Denver specifically, and found a forensic engineering company, Knott Laboratory, that seemingly did similar things. I just wanted to focus on existing buildings. That's kind of what I enjoyed. I didn't really know much about the forensics portion of that. It just kind of seemed like that would be a great fit for me. And so sought out that. And then once getting into the forensic side, it was that, but it was also the ability to learn how things fail, learn the legal system, learn the insurance industry, what goes on in all of those situations after something goes awry in a construction project, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. You started your career destroying things, then you figured out how to repair things, and now you figure out what went wrong.
Yeah, yeah, and figuring out that to a degree that can stand up in court, can be written format, so that you're providing this to an insurance company or attorney who wants to know why it happened one way or another, and how you know that, and how confident you are in those conclusions. It's just like doing building assessments. You just have to articulate it very well to laypersons, right? Attorneys, insurance adjusters, um, owners even don't necessarily understand some of the technical components of structural engineering and building materials, and so we're tasked with articulating that in a manner where they can understand that.
Mm. So, obviously, these things can these sort of failures or issues can come up in different ways. I mean, what's your process to try to figure out what happened?
Um, it's it's very dependent on what we're investigating, whether it's foundation movement, and we're trying to figure out what is causing that foundation movement, or whether it's a moisture intrusion into a building. Ultimately, I mean, I do speak very highly of the scientific method. So developing hypotheses and then proving yourself wrong, right? So develop everything as wide as you possibly can. What are all of the reasons that this could have, that these circumstances could have happened, right? And then go through and start to analyze and weed out how you can scientifically prove that, well, it didn't happen that way because of this. And it's very much deductive reasoning. It's ruling out those components that yeah, we know it didn't happen that way. We know it didn't happen this way. We know it didn't fail here. We know it didn't fail here. So we're getting in on narrowing in on our potential hypotheses of which one it could have been, and then you're pulling in whatever testing methods that we can to add more data to that situation, right? And that may happen very early on, and maybe after you've kind of done a little bit of just on-site field work to look at things. But data can be soil testing, pulling cores. That can be destructive testing, actually opening up, look, digging up a part of the foundation, or opening up part of the wall assembly, and selectively looking at how all of the flashing materials come together in the roofing systems and the deck and everything, and where could that potential breach be that are creating these circumstances that everybody's concerned about.
Yeah, and is there sort of a prioritization from like invasive, sort of destructive testing versus things that you could kind of do without, pulling cores and stuff like that, or do certain things you just go right into it to try to rule things out?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, start with the simple stuff and start with visual assessments and what could potentially be there. Rule out those things on the front side, and maybe you get all the way down to, well, it has to be this. It can't be anything else because of X, Y, and Z, and therefore you don't necessarily need to go do destructive testing or coring or whatever. And in that circumstance, depending on who's asking and the amount of confidence that you want in that solution, maybe you really know, and a coring is just a means of proving what we already suspected from the visual observations, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
So
there's certainly different levels.
yeah. So if this is going to appear in legal, I'm assuming at every step of the way you're documenting the process you're going or into investigating this.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you need to be able to justify, if somebody was not there to see everything that you saw, you've got to be able to take them through that explanation to so that some other person of equal qualifications or more qualifications or more experience in that subject matter can understand how you ruled out all of the other components. So you really are dissecting this layer by layer and getting into it and documenting it layer by layer as well so that you can show that to another person.
Yeah. And you mentioned legal, insurance, all these things. Where do you sit, or do you get brought in at different clients, different levels, depending on the situation?
Yeah, we sit in and get called by plaintiffs' attorneys who are representing owners of buildings. We get contacted by contractors, and their either their counsel directly. Sometimes the contractor themselves know about us, and so they'll contact us and want us to help walk through a solution or help them through a situation. It can be the insurance companies or the attorneys, the defense counsel that's representing those insurance attorneys, and those insurance companies are generally, they're supporting a contractor, a general contractor, or a subcontractor who really just want to. Most of the time, the insurance companies just want to know that they're paying for what is their responsibility, right? They generally don't have an issue paying for. This is my experience. Others might have something else. They generally don't mind paying for what their insured is responsible for, but they don't want to pay extra. They don't want to. They don't want somebody else's responsibility being laid over on a subcontractor or something like that. So we get hired by each of those each of those parties to navigate it, from any perspective. And it could be really early on, and there's no litigation involved or anything like that. It's simply there's some leaks in a building that whatever somewhat complicated, or maybe there's been a couple repairs and it hasn't fixed the situation. And so now we're coming in to help, just find solutions and see if we can get down to the bottom of what has happened and what's causing that, and then ultimately how do we fix it and prevent it from occurring again.
Yeah, and from a practical aspect, I'm assuming scope is related a bit, sometimes to budget on the client.
Yeah, yeah, and so you navigate that with what they need to know, and ultimately, if they're not willing to provide enough budget or enough scope, if you will, to do a thorough investigation, well, then your findings are left with qualifiers, right? It's based on this amount of analysis. There was no destructive testing, there was no coring, there was no whatever, right? And so based on everything that I see, I think with a reasonable degree of engineering certainty, it is X, or maybe it needs to be X, Y, or Z, and you have to lay that out in your report. So scope can be a limiting component that you have to navigate in this field for sure.
Sure. I mean, you've gone through the ranks through this organization, moving up. I mean, how has your role changed as you've moved up in this organization?
Um, initially, just kind of boots on the ground, right? Learning the industry, doing the simpler investigations with peers that are kind of going through and helping. It's a lot of on the job training in this field. You're learning from the peers. It's not like anybody goes through school to get a forensic engineering degree. You're learning all of this stuff on the field. So going out doing inspections, and then as you gain um, confidence and experience in certain levels of investigations, then you kind of run those investigations on your own. Go out, knock it out. Um, and in our world, everything is peer reviewed, so you're always trying to find the holes in circumstances, whether I'm doing a peer review for somebody else, one of the other team members that we have, or whether I mean, even today, all of my stuff as the principal engineer at Knott Laboratory, all of my stuff is peer reviewed.
Really? How does
There's
that work? Like when you have it goes to a certain person, a committee, like how is it looked at?
It's dependent on each project, but generally you're trying to find the most expertise that you can pull in to peer review that, right? And it doesn't, a lot of our stuff, our organization is very much a collaboration, where when an assignment comes in, we're trying to find a few folks on those complicated situations that have experience in those areas to pull together, right? So it might be just one person out in the field grabbing the documentation and all that stuff, but there was a lot of pre-planning that went into that and brainstorming that goes into it beforehand, to make sure that you're being comprehensive and you're getting as much data. And then subsequently, a lot of those reports can be generated, written by multiple people who have the expertise, have a combined expertise that's greater than myself or any individual, and putting those together. So the to your original question, as far as development, you just gain more experience as you progress through it. What changes from a primary, engineer technician doing investigations into other stuff, or into leadership and yeah, growth in our organization, is the business side of things, right? Understanding our value proposition. How do I become a valued team member for whoever is hiring us, and do a really good job of answering the questions, but understanding their job, right? So the more that we understand about our clients' needs and what their objectives are, the better we can fulfill those components. And so as you move through the organization and gain training, you understand the different failure mechanisms, but also who cares about what, and then and navigate those components. And so ultimately moving through the organization to the CEO and a principal engineer, I'm just another engineer. I have a lot of experience, but I use peers to review my stuff just the same as anybody else in the organization. The CEO side of it is obviously just running, all of the business operations concurrently with that, and hiring, experts that fit into and bolster us as a team, right? Looking at their background, looking at the things that we're really pulling together a bunch of different expertise from many different areas. From mechanical engineers to civil structural engineers and on visualization experts and stuff like that. You're um, you're looking to kind of fill in those gaps, and everybody has this little unique thing that they did in their past. They might have a ton of experience with light gauge steel, or they might have a ton of experience in transportation engineering. um, and it's really fun in my seat now to get those guys to aggregate, to work together, and 1 plus 1 equals 3, right? That's really cool, and that's when you're really driving value proposition for your clients and figuring out solutions that just one person, we have limitations. We only have a certain amount of experience and education and so forth. So getting people to work together is kind of the fun part of my job now, and coming up with ways of figuring out how something failed or happened, right?
Yeah. Now, in terms of seeing lots of things, seeing how they failed, and this is, I understand this is you and your firm only, but if you notice any trends, things that you see more common, anything like that?
Yeah, I think um, there's there's less. I think a trend in the industry is that there's less oversight over the entire projects, and there's certain levels of markets, right? You get to large scale projects, and you have a site superintendent or multiple superintendents, project managers that are actually on site that are facilitating all the trades. Today's building materials are complex, and there's the problems happen at the integration between trades. And so, the roofing contractor doesn't necessarily, know about the building facade component unless there's somebody, the captain of the ship out there to make sure that those components are integrated together. And really, that's where the failures happen in most times. Most times, it's not the material; it's these interactions between materials that were different trades. So I think the construction, constraints on budgets, timing, and everybody pushing to have things as fast as possible, constraints on budgets, limitations of that. I think that is the biggest component that is contributing to errors in construction, in modern construction, right?
Mm,
And it's not, and we have huge projects. It's not, to go to a single family home where one person does everything. That's long gone, right? Now you have to have a superintendent or a project manager on a residential project to just even coordinate plumbers and framers and HVAC contractors.
yeah. And how much, the transition, I get it, oversight on bigger projects is more oversight. On smaller projects, there's less oversight from the general contractor or the subcontractor. Yeah, how much of the pressure from sort of being able to find workers and laborers, even if it's just a sub trade, roofing, affects the quality of the outcome?
I think that labor is a huge component of that. It impacts the individual trades. It impacts the project managers. You also have, the cost of that labor. So you're limited on projects. I mean, general contractors are having to make decisions on how much time they can afford to have 1 or 10 people on a project, right? And so there's a balance of of how many people can you afford and have on this project versus um, what versus the cost of the labor. So those things are very tied together.
Yeah, and I guess if they try to save on the front end, and then something bad happens in the back end, there's an investigation and all that stuff. So it would cost more going the the short term way, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a balance, of that, and each contractor, has different levels of experience dealing with those and ways to navigate their their quality control, procedures and so forth, and their oversight. It's also a component of integration with the architects and engineers, right, with RFIs and that process of getting, I mean, as an engineer, we would love to see every step of the way, but that's not necessarily budget, feasible, depending on the project, right? But there's just always these. It's a balancing of risk versus the economy or the economics of it, and you can't afford to have the engineer and the architect and the site superintendent looking over every single component of it. And so there has to be some decisions made in there on what are those critical components where you are going to have, or where the site superintendent is going to make sure that they're on site watching these two trays to go together, or this sequence of systems. And then when do you need architectural inspections, when do you need structural engineering inspections, name the engineer, when do you need them out there having that oversight as well? And so it's a huge balancing act to figure that out.
Yeah, for sure. So you just mentioned, bring people in at critical points. I mean, what other strategies do you think work for smaller projects or even smaller contractors to help them sort of be successful, even if they don't have the resources or the ability to pull these experts on site for everything?
Yeah, I think mock-ups are fantastic if you've got depending on the scale of the project. If you have the opportunity to do a small mock-up of windows or doors and flashings and components, specifically if they're kind of complicated, those are well worth the value. I mean, we have some clients that will have us come out and do flood testing on the mock-up system, or the first ones that they do, right? And that's being very proactive. And some of those contractors are at that level where they're having us, and they're also transferring some of the liability, right? They're now saying, look, that we mocked it up, we built it, we had this consultant come out and do a flood test per ASTM, blah blah blah, and we have no issues going forward. Well, that's going to create a very high caliber project that can happen. I think that's the Cadillac. So walking that back, just kind of filling in those gaps and the thinking through the integration of trades. I think that's the critical component on budget sensitive projects, is when these two trades come together, and kind of the sequence of construction as well, right? Who's installing the flashings, who's installing the siding, who's installing the roofing adjacent. Just having those people talk and have a conversation about, hey, remember, I'm going to have this flashing that has to go in before your roofing material, right? Because based on sequences, those kind of pre-construction planning and thinking through at that level can go miles.
Yeah. So basically slowing down so you could go faster.
Slowing down and more work on the more thought process, and sequencing, more thoughts on the specific sequencing and collaboration of the contractors on the front side. That's probably a fantastic risk mitigation tool if you can have those minds actually looking at, here's the project, you know these are all of the components that we need to be making sure. And I think you get rid of a lot of I think you stop a lot of problems at that phase.
Yeah. For a company like yours, what does the marketing or outreach look like for your business?
Yeah, it's so we have, yeah, marketing and sales staff members, and so we're a very diverse company as far as who the clients that we're serving. It's largely word of mouth, but we're obviously using word of mouth to further that and establish a broader um, customer base. The um, the marketing is just pushing out all of the different services that we can do, and ours we have so many lessons learned from the forensic side of things that we have tried to, specifically by example, we have tried to push that into building assessments. We That seems to be the way of of can taking the information that we've learned from these failures and getting it back into practice, or at least heading off bigger problems for communities, owners, and so forth. Um, and the the diversity of the projects, it's just kind of integrating and understanding who those clients are and what information that we can take from one segment of the business and pass that off to the others. And that's what our marketing and sales team is. That's what we're always kind of having conversations about, is how do we, you know, yeah, how do we take this value proposition and provide it over to these clients over here?
Got it. So it sounds like word of mouth. There's some cross selling,
Yeah.
possibly the assessments as a early way to get relationships going, and an ever growing bunch of case studies that lead to, posting, maybe a bit of SEO that could,
Yeah.
finds those very very specific people that are looking for something for their case.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Very cool. Awesome. Is there anything that I did not ask you, but you wanted to share?
Um, I guess just something to be aware of is the post Surfside environment and that collapse, that disaster that happened. Um, the build. So there's multiple people that are coming at that problem, and it's an economics problem. It's a building maintenance problem, and so forth. The NCSEA and the Structural Engineers Association, National Structural Engineers Association, are working to help educate our engineers on things that we can be looking at, right? So taking it from just the pencil and paper at a desk, and now actually going out in the field and looking at something in the field, now that it's 20 years old or 30 years old and it's been through the environment effects. How does it how What problems rely in there? And there's a lot of work that's going on with ICC and guidelines and so forth, trying to push the regulation. I mean, Florida has started this with the regulations down in Florida to require HOAs and things like HOAs to have reserve funds and to do these milestone inspections at 30 years and so forth. And I think that that's something that's going to be coming across the country a little bit more. There's no regulations. It's even come up in like New York. I mean, New York has some facade requirements, inspections, milestone inspections, and things like that, parking structure inspections. But there's nothing that's focused on the buildings themselves and the aging infrastructure. And I think that's something that I'm passionate about, is just extending the life of our existing infrastructure, and how do we do that. And really it takes a little bit of proactive thought process and maintenance. There'll be times where some real maintenance is required on some of these properties, and communities need to have the funds available to do that, and that is a huge economic divergence. It's so hard for us to fund maintenance of our buildings and for people to kind of get on board. But the exponential growth of the cost of repair is, if you fix it here, it costs this amount. 5 years it costs that amount. 10 years it costs 10 times that. And so anyhow, I think it's something that the industry needs to be paying attention to and trying to work harder on, and just be proactive in our maintenance schedules and what we're doing with our infrastructure.
Yeah, certainly, having some regulations around inspection of the building would stop people from, keep hunting it down
Yeah.
the road, and also, like, and not to those, situations where you find out later that there's, 4 or 5 roofs built on top of each other, and
Yeah,
the building is no longer safe. So certainly it stops those things from occurring.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
All
So
right. Well, thank you, Stanley. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and expertise.
yeah, thanks, Tats. Appreciate it.